April 16, 1941, a little after 11 o'clock at night, somewhere over the county of Hampshire in southern England, at 15,000 feet, a Heinkel 111 bomber of the German Air Force is holding a steady course toward the coast and the sea and home. The 4 men inside her have done this before. They have flown across the darkened counties of England more times than they can count, and they have learned the shape of the work. The dark is their friend. The dark is the whole point. In daylight, over this same island the summer before, bombers like theirs were torn out of the sky by fighters that seemed to know exactly where to be. So they came at night instead, and at night the arithmetic changed. At night the fighters blundered about beneath them, like men searching a black field for a lost coin. At night, a bomber was a single grey moth in an ocean of ink, and the ocean was on the bomber's side. The pilot is easy in his seat. The engines are running clean. The raid on the city behind them went as briefed, and then, without a sound, and without a warning, and without the faintest reason his crew will ever be able to give, the aircraft is no longer flying. There is a hammering from behind and below, a stitching of cannon shells walking up the fuselage from the tail, and the port engine is a sheet of flame, and the controls have gone soft and strange in the pilot's hands. No searchlight found them first. No other aircraft was seen. There was nothing in the mirror, and nothing in the black, and then there was fire. One of the crew will survive the night in a prisoner of war cage, and when his interrogators ask him what happened, he will not be able to tell them. He did not see what hit him. None of them saw what hit them. That is the part that will spread through the bomber squadrons of the German Air Force in the spring of 1941, like a slow, cold sickness. Not that men were dying. Men had always died. It was that they were dying in the dark to something they could not see, could not hear, until it was too late, and could not explain. Hold on that word, explain, because this is not really a story about one bomber over Hampshire. This is a story about knowledge, and about who holds it, and about what happens to men who are certain they understand the rules of a game that has quietly, without their permission, changed underneath them. This is a story about how a nation learns to see in the dark. This is the story of the night war over Britain, and of the strange machine of people and science and radio waves that Britain built to win it. To understand why a German bomber crew could not explain the fire that killed them, you have to understand what those crews believed about the night, and to understand that, you have to go back to the summer that came before. In the daylight battles of 1940, the German Air Force had run into something it did not fully comprehend and did not sufficiently respect. British fighters kept appearing in the right place at the right height at the right moment, again and again, with an economy that could not be luck. The reason was a chain of tall masts along the southern and eastern coasts of England, and behind the masts a system. The masts were radar, though the British did not call it that yet. They called it RDF, for radio direction finding, and they had spent the second half of the 1930s building a coastal fence of it, while the rest of the world was barely paying attention. The radar looked out to sea. It caught the German formations as they gathered over France and crossed the Channel, and it fed their height and bearing and rough number into a network of telephone lines and plotting tables and controllers who could then send fighters to intercept, rather than wasting them on standing patrols that guessed. The Germans knew the masts were there. They could hardly miss them. What they did not do was take them seriously enough, and that failure of respect began earlier than the battle itself. In the last months of peace, the German signals service under General Wolfgang Martini had grown curious about those masts. So the Germans did something quite ingenious and quite German in its thoroughness. They loaded radio receiving equipment aboard an airship, one of the great Zeppelins left over from a more elegant age, and they flew it up the eastern coast of Britain to listen. The idea was sound. Find out what frequencies the strange towers were transmitting on, and you could measure the threat and prepare to blind it. The airship droned along the coastline with its aerials straining for the enemy's secrets, and it heard, in effect, nothing useful. There are competing accounts of why. Some hold that the crew dismissed the signals they did hear as ordinary background noise. Some hold that the Germans were looking for shorter wavelengths, the kind their own excellent equipment favored, and simply did not credit that the British would be running their air defense on the long, clumsy wavelengths the masts actually used. Some accounts even suggest the airship's own transmissions were drowning the very signals it had come to catch. Whatever the true mix of reasons, the outcome was the same. The most sophisticated electronic reconnaissance mission of the pre-war period flew the length of Britain's radar coast and came home believing there was not much there. The German intelligence assessments that followed, produced by staff officers whose job was to know the enemy, rated British radar as something between primitive and unimportant. This was not stupidity, it was something more dangerous than stupidity. It was a confident, well-staffed, professionally reasoned conclusion that happened to be wrong. So when the daylight battle turned against them, the German Air Force drew what looked like the obvious lesson. If the enemy could see you coming by day, then take away the seeing. Come at night. The reasoning held together beautifully inside the frame the Germans were thinking in. Radar found formations in the daytime sky, yes, but everyone understood that a fighter still had to close the final distance with the human eye, and the human eye is useless in the dark. A pilot at night could be vectored toward a general patch of sky and still see nothing but stars and the dim smear of the ground far below. The bombers, meanwhile, could navigate to English cities using radio beams transmitted from the continent, clever systems with names like Knickerbein and Exgerate that laid an invisible road across the sky straight to the target. The bomber did not need to see the ground, and the fighter could not see the bomber. Night was armor plate that weighed nothing and cost nothing, and through the autumn of 1940, that belief was rewarded almost every single night. The change of course had a name in retrospect: the Blitz. From September of 1940, the weight of the German effort shifted from the airfields and the daylight sky onto the cities themselves, and onto the hours of darkness. London was hammered night after night for weeks without pause. Then the provincial cities, the industrial heart of the country, the ports, and the defences that had performed so well in the sunlit battle were suddenly, humiliatingly, almost helpless. The anti-aircraft guns fired huge quantities of shells into the dark and brought down very little, though the noise was good for civilian morale, and so the firing continued partly for that reason. The searchlights swung their pale columns across the clouds and only occasionally caught anything, and the night fighters, such as they were, went up and groped about and mostly came home having seen nothing at all. In the closing months of 1940, the German Air Force flew many thousands of bombing sorties against Britain by night. The number its night fighters managed to destroy in return, across all those raids, could be counted on your fingers. The bomber crews were not wrong about the arithmetic. The dark really was on their side. The question that hangs over the whole story is how, in the space of a single winter, the British changed that arithmetic so completely that a bomber crew over Hampshire in April could be killed by something they never saw and could not name. The answer is not a single invention and not a single genius, though the story has been told that way many times, and the tidy version does a disservice to the truth. The answer is that three very difficult things all came right at roughly the same moment, over the turn of that winter, and only when all three were working together did the darkness begin to give up its secrets. To see how, you have to leave the German cockpit and cross to the other side of the channel and meet a very different kind of person from the professional staff officer who had rated British radar as unimportant. You have to meet the boffins. That word deserves a moment because it carries most of the argument of this story inside it. Boffin was wartime slang, affectionate and slightly mocking at once, for the civilian scientists and engineers who attached themselves to the armed forces and worked at the strange seam where pure research met the blunt demands of battle. A boffin was not quite a soldier and not quite a don. He was a physicist who suddenly needed to understand why a radar set failed at low altitude, or a mathematician working out how to talk a pilot onto a target he could not see. Britain in these years had a peculiar tolerance, almost an affection, for the gifted amateur and the unattached expert, the sort of mind that did not fit the official chart and had to be found a corner to work in. It was a national habit older than the war. The country that produced the lone naturalist and the vicar with a telescope and the retired engineer tinkering in a shed also produced, when the pressure came, a loose and quarrelsome and brilliant community of men who could be handed an impossible problem and left largely alone to solve it. The German system, for all its formidable strengths, was built differently. It ran through hierarchy and specification and the great industrial combines, and it produced magnificent hardware. But it did not easily make room for the awkward outsider with the strange idea, and it did not, in the critical winter, produce a working answer to the night fighting problem as fast as the awkward outsiders across the Channel did. This is not a claim that one nation was cleverer than the other. It is a claim about which kind of system could turn cleverness into a working weapon quickly and under what conditions. Hold that thought, because the whole verdict of the story rests on it. British radar had grown up in the second half of the 1930s out of a committee and a country house. The committee, chaired by the scientist Henry Tizard, had been asked to look into the air defence of Britain at a time when it was widely believed that the bomber would always get through and that there was no real defence against it. A rumour was going round about a death ray, a beam that could destroy an aircraft or kill its crew from a distance, and the committee dutifully asked whether such a thing was possible. The physicist Robert Watson Watt was consulted, and he and his assistant Arnold Wilkins worked out that no, you could not destroy an aircraft with radio waves. The energies involved were absurd. But, they pointed out, you could very likely detect one. A metal aircraft flying through a radio beam would send back a faint echo, and if you could catch that echo, you could know the aircraft was there long before you could see it. In February of 1935, they proved the principle with a borrowed transmitter and an aircraft flown back and forth through its beam, and the needle on their instrument twitched to the rhythm of the passing plane. That demonstration set the whole edifice in motion. The work moved to a rambling manor house on the Suffolk coast called Bawdsey, and the small team there became the seed of everything that followed. At Bawdsey, one of Watson Watt's recruits, a young Welsh physicist named Edward Bowen, was given permission to try something even harder than coastal radar. He was asked to put a radar set inside an aircraft. This was a genuinely outrageous ambition for the technology of the time. The coastal stations used equipment the size of buildings, with masts hundreds of feet tall. Bowen had to shrink all of that down to something that would fit in the nose of a fighter, run off the aircraft's own electrical supply, survive the cold and the vibration and the violence of flight, and still be sensitive enough to catch the whisper of an echo from another aircraft a mile or two away in the dark. His small group, working in the towers of the old manor, gnawed at the problem for years. They gave the airborne set a name, airborne interception, which everyone shortened to the initials, and they numbered the successive versions as they struggled toward something usable. Bowen's team understood early a fact that would shape the whole night war. A fighter carrying this equipment would need a healthy margin of speed over the bombers it hunted, something on the order of a quarter again as fast, because a radar contact ahead in the dark is no use if you cannot overhaul it before it slips away. That single requirement, a genuinely fast aircraft, would turn out to be one of the three things that all had to come right at once. The early airborne sets were, to put it plainly, bad. The men who had to use them in the first winter of the night Blitz have left us their frustration in plain words. The picture on the little screens was a mess of flickering blips and false returns, hard to read even in a quiet laboratory, and nearly impossible in a bucketing aircraft at night with your life on the line. The sets had a maximum range of only a few miles, which sounds workable until you realize they also had a minimum range. Below a few hundred feet of separation, the echo of the target drowned in the echo of the fighter's own transmitter, so that just as the hunter closed to the distance where he might finally glimpse his prey, the screen went blind. And below a certain height, the radiation bouncing back off the ground itself swamped everything in a blizzard of false signal. The operator, crouched over his tubes behind a leather hood to keep out the cabin light, was often reduced to guesswork, calling instructions to his pilot that were half science and half intuition. Time and again in that first winter, the German aircraft simply got away, and the fighter crew landed cursing a machine that promised so much and delivered so little. The aircraft carrying these troubled sets was, at first, badly suited to the work as well. The early night fighters were converted Bristol Blenheims, a light bomber pressed into a role it was never designed for. The Blenheim was too slow to reliably catch the German bombers, which was exactly the failure Bowen's team had predicted, and it was too lightly armed to be sure of destroying one even when it did make contact. So here, at the start of the winter of 1940, you have the whole problem laid out. A ground system that lost track of aircraft the moment they crossed the coast and flew inland. An airborne radar set that was unreliable and blind at close range and low height. And a fighter aircraft too slow to catch its quarry and too weak to kill it cleanly. 3 broken things. And the story of the next few months is the story of all 3 being fixed, more or less together, by different people working on different pieces of the same puzzle, until one night they clicked into a single functioning machine. The first piece to come right was the aircraft. The Bristol company had been developing a new heavy fighter, and it arrived in squadron service in the autumn of 1940, at very nearly the moment it was most desperately needed. It was called the Beaufighter, and it changed everything. It was fast enough, with a top speed comfortably above 300 miles an hour, to run down a German bomber and stay with it. It was savagely armed, carrying 4 20mm cannon in its belly and a battery of machine guns in its wings, so heavily gunned that for a while it may have been the most powerfully armed fighter anywhere in the world. A single well-aimed burst from a Beaufighter could tear a bomber apart, which was exactly what a night fighter needed, because in the dark you might only get one chance and one fleeting sight of the enemy. And crucially, because those big cannon were mounted low in the fuselage rather than crowded into the nose itself was left free to hold the aerials and the apparatus of the airborne radar set. The Beaufighter was roomy enough to carry the bulky early equipment that no small single-seat fighter could have swallowed, and it had the 2 seats the work demanded, one for the pilot and one for the man who would learn to read the dark. The aircraft and the radar had, almost by accident, been made for each other. The second piece to come right was the radar itself, and here progress was less a single leap than a grind of patient improvement, driven by the scientists and by the aircrew feeding back what actually happened in the air. The version of the airborne set that mattered most in this winter operated on a wavelength of about 1.5 meters, and could, when it worked, hold a contact out to around 4 miles and guide a fighter down to that frustrating close blind spot a few hundred feet behind the target. It was not elegant. It demanded enormous skill from its operator, but in the right hands it worked often enough to matter, and the right hands were being trained even as the sets were being built. Meanwhile, further back from the front line, in a laboratory at the University of Birmingham, 2 physicists named John Randall and Harry Boot had built in February of 1940 a small device that would eventually transform radar for the whole of the Allied war effort. It was called the cavity magnetron, and it generated radio waves of very short wavelength at power levels that had simply not been possible before, jumping the available output at that wavelength by a factor of hundreds. Short wavelengths meant smaller aerials and sharper, more detailed radar pictures, and the magnetron would in time make possible a new generation of centimetric airborne sets, far better than anything flying in the Blitz. That fuller flowering came a little later, but the magnetron belongs in the story here because it shows the same national habit at work. 2 young men in a university laboratory handed a hard problem and the freedom to crack it, and because Britain, remarkably, chose to carry this crown jewel of a secret across the Atlantic and share it with the still neutral United States, judging that the alliance to come mattered more than the hoarding of an advantage. That decision, to give away the best thing you have made in order to bind a friend closer, is itself a very particular kind of confidence. The third piece is the one that is most often left out of the tidy version of the story, and it is the one that truly turned the key. It was a new kind of ground radar, and a new way of using it. The coastal radar chain that had won the daylight battle faced out to sea and was nearly useless once a raider crossed the coast and flew on over the darkened land. What was needed was a radar that could see in every direction at once, out over the land as well as the water, and could present what it saw not as a jumble of readings to be interpreted, but as a picture. The answer was a rotating aerial married to a new kind of display, a circular screen with the radar station at its center and every aircraft shown as a moving point of light at its true range and bearing, the sweep of a bright line going round and painting the targets afresh with each pass. It is the image of radar that everyone now carries in their head, the glowing circle and the turning line, and it was born in this period out of sheer operational need. The stations built around this idea were called ground-controlled interception stations, and the difference they made was not incremental. It was staggering. Under the old system, a controller trying to bring a night fighter to a bomber over land was working with reported positions that might be 5 miles adrift, which in the dark is another word for hopeless, because a night fighter crew might only see an enemy aircraft from a few hundred feet away. Under the new system, a controller watching the circular screen could see both the bomber and the fighter as points of light on the same picture, and could speak to the pilot by radio and steer him, turn by turn, until the 2 points were almost touching, until the fighter's own airborne set could pick up the target in its narrow beam and take over for the final stalk. The first of these stations to be trialled went into service near the south coast, right at the end of 1940, and the first purpose-built station was declared ready for operations on the very first day of 1941. The improvement it produced in the rate of successful interceptions was not a matter of a few percent. Where the old chain had brought fighters to their targets perhaps 1 attempt in 10, the new radar and its circular screen brought them together the great majority of the time in trials. More stations were rushed into service within weeks. A web of them began to spread across the approaches to the cities, each one a pair of watching eyes that did not blink at nightfall, each one able to take a fighter by the hand and lead it through the dark to within a few hundred feet of an enemy who had no idea it was being hunted. Now put the 3 pieces together, because that is the whole point, and that is what the German bomber crews could never see from inside their cockpits. A fast, heavily armed aircraft that could both catch a bomber and destroy it. An airborne radar set, difficult but workable, that could guide that aircraft through the last mile or two of blackness. And a ground radar that could find the bomber over land, hold it on a glowing screen, and vector the fighter to the exact patch of empty-looking sky where the airborne set would find it. No single one of these would have sufficed. The Beaufighter without radar was just a fast aircraft blundering in the dark. The airborne set without the ground control had no way of being pointed at anything in the first place. The ground control without a capable fighter and a working airborne set was a beautiful picture of a problem it could not solve. It was the union of the 3, over the turn of that winter, that made the darkness navigable. And it was the fact that this union was invisible, that it lived in radio waves and telephone lines and the quiet voices of controllers, that made it impossible for the men on the receiving end to understand what was killing them. Because think about it from inside the Heinkel again. From up there, on a clear cold night over England, nothing had changed. The same dark counties slid by below. The same stars burned overhead. There was no visible fence, no obvious new weapon, no searchlight cone that betrayed the trap. The bomber flew on exactly as it had flown for months, and then it was on fire, and the men who might have explained it were mostly dead. The few who lived and were captured could report only that they had been hit from behind and below by cannon fire from an aircraft they never saw. And what could the German intelligence officers make of that? An aircraft they never saw. It was almost worse than useless as information. It fed every dark rumor and no clear conclusion. Some German crews began to believe the British had developed some fiendish new night vision. Some blamed luck, or the searchlights, or their own navigation. Very few of them landed on the truth, which was that a machine made of people and radio waves had been watching them the whole time and had simply, for the first time, learned how to reach out and touch them in the black. And this is where the British did something almost mischievous, and very shrewd, to keep the truth hidden a little longer. The airborne radar was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. It would be a catastrophe if the Germans learned that their bombers were being found by radar carried inside the fighters themselves, because they might then change their tactics or pour effort into jamming it. So the problem was how to explain, to the public and by extension to any listening enemy, why one particular young night fighter pilot was suddenly so extraordinarily good at finding and killing German bombers in the dark. The pilot was a man named John Cunningham, of a squadron that had converted to Beaufighters, and his run of victories in the first months of 1941 was remarkable. The authorities let it be known, through the newspapers, that his uncanny success was down to his exceptional eyesight, and that his eyesight was so keen because he ate a great many carrots. The story was helped along by a genuine campaign at home, run by the Ministry of Food, urging a population under rationing to eat plentiful homegrown carrots, complete with cheerful cartoon characters and slogans about seeing in the blackout. Cunningham was saddled with the nickname Cat's Eyes, which he detested for the rest of his life, and the legend that carrots give you night vision entered the folklore of the English-speaking world, where it survives to this day at every dinner table where a child is told to eat up. It is worth being honest about this tale, because the honest version is better than the myth. Historians who have looked carefully at it doubt that the carrot story was ever seriously intended to deceive German intelligence, and doubt that it did. The German signals experts were perfectly aware that radar existed, since they had their own, and the notion that a British pilot's eyesight had suddenly improved would not have fooled a professional for long. The carrot campaign was real, and the Cat's Eyes nickname was real, and the two became joined in the public mind. But its main effect was at home, on morale and on the vegetable patch, rather than abroad, on the enemy. What actually kept the secret was hard security and the simple fact that a dead bomber crew tells no tales and a live one, hauled from a burning aircraft, had genuinely seen nothing. Cunningham himself was always clear-eyed about it. He knew perfectly well that his success had nothing to do with carrots. It had to do with a radar set in the nose of his aircraft, and a superbly skilled operator sitting behind him reading it, and a controller on the ground steering him through the dark, and the training and teamwork that bound all of it together. He described his success in later years as the work of a team standing on a pyramid, with the ground radar and the searchlights at the base, and his aircraft with its 2 men at the very tip. That image, the pyramid, is the truest thing anyone said about the whole business. The kill at the sharp point was only possible because of the enormous invisible structure beneath it. That structure ran on people, and a great many of those people were women. The plotting rooms and the radar screens and the telephone exchanges that made up the nervous system of the air defense were staffed in very large numbers by the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, which grew during the war into an organization of well over 100,000. Women plotted the tracks of raiders across the great map tables. Women operated radar sets and filtered the flood of reports into a coherent picture. Women spoke as controllers, and in some stations the interception of German bombers was being run, by the middle years of the war, almost entirely by female officers talking pilots onto their targets. The man at the sharp point of the pyramid got the medals and the newspaper stories and the nickname he hated, and he earned them. But the pyramid beneath him was built and operated in very large part by people whose names never reached a newspaper, and a fair share of them were women who went off shift at dawn, having helped kill men in the dark, and said little about it for the rest of their lives. The partnership at the tip of the pyramid, between the pilot and the man who read the radar, deserves its own moment, because it was the human heart of the whole system. A night fighter crew was 2 men in a black tube of an aircraft, utterly dependent on one another. The pilot flew and fired, and never took his eyes from the dark ahead. Behind him, the radar operator crouched over his little screens under a hood, translating the flickering blips into a stream of quiet instructions. Higher, lower, hard left, steady, he is a mile ahead of you, and a little above. Come right, gently now. The 2 of them had to think almost as one mind, in the dark, in the cold, in the knowledge that a mistake meant either an escaped enemy, or a collision, or a burst of return fire from a bomber's gunner who had seen them coming. Cunningham's own operator, a man named Jimmy Rawnsley, later wrote one of the classic accounts of this strange, intimate work, and the picture he gives is not of glory, but of patience, exhaustion, endless practice, and the slow accumulation of a skill that could not be taught quickly or cheaply. The best crews flew together for months and years and came to trust one another completely, and it was that trust, as much as any machine, that put bombers into the sea. By the spring of 1941, the machine was working, and the figures tell the story of a turning. In the first month of that year, the night fighters made only a handful of contacts and fewer kills. Month by month, the numbers climbed, as the Beaufighters and the airborne sets and the ground stations multiplied, and the crews grew practiced. In March of 1941, the night fighters destroyed around 22 German bombers. In April, the figure roughly doubled. In May, in the last great convulsion of the Blitz, the night defences destroyed close to 100 aircraft. John Cunningham had his most successful single night in the middle of April, when he shot down 3 bombers in one sortie, landed, went up again, and destroyed 2 more, a night's work that would have been unimaginable for any British night fighter pilot 6 months earlier. On the night of the 10th of May, the night of the heaviest raid London ever suffered, when the House of Commons itself was wrecked and nearly 1,500 civilians were killed, the night fighters had their best night of the entire campaign, tearing 14 bombers out of the sky. The dark, which had been armor plate for the German crews in the autumn, was becoming a trap by the spring, closing quietly around them, raid by raid. Honesty compels an important qualification here, and it is exactly the sort of qualification that separates real history from flattering myth. Even at its best, in that ferocious May, the proportion of German bombers being shot down on any given night remained low. The bombers came in their hundreds and lost, on a bad night, a few dozen, and across the whole campaign, the loss rate stayed at only a small percentage of the sorties flown. The night fighters were not slaughtering the German Air Force wholesale, and it would be false to say they drove it from the sky by force alone. What they had done was more subtle and, in its way, more important. They had turned the night from a place of near total safety into a place of real and rising danger, where a crew that had once expected to come home now had to reckon, every single time, with the invisible hunter and the fire out of nowhere. And there is a further truth, that the triumphant version tends to hurry past. The Blitz did not end because the night fighters beat it. It ended because the German leadership turned its attention east, toward the coming invasion of the Soviet Union, and pulled the bomber squadrons away to other work. The rising toll the night defences were taking was real, and it made the night campaign more costly and less sustainable than it had been. But the final decision to break off was made in Berlin for reasons of grand strategy, not forced by fighter command alone. History is usually a matter of several causes braided together, and anyone who offers you a single tidy one is selling something. It is worth pausing, too, on the fact that the Germans were not fools and were not incapable, because the easy version of this story would have them as plodding and unimaginative, and that is both unfair and untrue. Faced with the reverse problem, defending their own cities and occupied territory against the growing weight of British bombers by night, the Germans built a night defense system of their own that was, in time, formidable, elaborate, and deadly. They strung a belt of radar-controlled zones across the approaches from the west, each zone a box of sky in which ground radar would track an intruder and guide a night fighter onto it, a system the Allies came to know by the name of the officer who built it. They developed their own airborne radar for their own night fighters. In the years that followed, they would inflict fearful losses on British bomber crews in the darkness over Germany. The point of comparison is not that the Germans could not do this kind of work. They plainly could, and did, and British aircrew paid a terrible price for it later in the war. The point is one of timing and of sequence. In the specific problem of catching bombers at night, the British got there first, in that winter of 1940 to 1941, when they had to, and the German equivalent matured only afterward. Their first successful radar-guided night interception came in the summer of 1941, the better part of a year after a British Beaufighter first killed a bomber with the help of its airborne set. In a war where months could decide the fate of a city, that head start was not a small thing. Why did the British get there first? Not because their scientists were cleverer as individuals, for the Germans had superb scientists and engineers and proved it repeatedly. The difference was structural, and it is the difference this whole story has been circling. The British had built, almost without meaning to, a system that let odd, unattached, awkward people be handed real problems and real resources and left to get on with it, and that let the men who actually flew the aircraft argue directly with the men who built the equipment, and that could take an idea from a laboratory in a country house to a working station on a clifftop in a matter of months. It was a system with room in it for the amateur and the outsider, and the impatient genius who did not fit the official chart. The scientist working inside the intelligence service on the enemy's radio beams, a young man who had the ear of the highest levels of government, is another face of the same thing, a nation willing to put a clever civilian in a room where he could actually change what happened. The German system concentrated its formidable energies through hierarchy and industry and the will of a few men at the top, and it built wonderful machines, but it was slower to let the awkward outsider into the room where the decision got made. That, in the end, is the answer to the question the title asks. The German bombers could not explain how the RAF shot them down in the darkness, because the thing that killed them was not a weapon they could point to. It was a way of organizing knowledge and a willingness to trust the unglamorous, patient, collective work of a great many people, most of whom never saw a German aircraft in their lives. That is the verdict, but a verdict is not the whole of the truth, and this story would be a poor and dishonest thing if it ended on the clean satisfaction of British ingenuity rewarded. The night war was not a clever puzzle, it was a slaughter, and the people who paid for it were mostly not the scientists and not the aircrew on either side. They were the people asleep in the cities below. The reason any of this mattered, the reason the night fighters existed at all, was that German bombers were burning British towns and killing British civilians in enormous numbers. Across the whole Blitz, something on the order of 40,000 and more civilians were killed, roughly half of them in London, with more than 1 million houses damaged or destroyed in the capital alone. On a single night in November of 1940, the city of Coventry was so comprehensively wrecked, its medieval cathedral gutted, hundreds of its people killed in a few hours, that the German propaganda machine coined a new verb meaning to annihilate a city from the air. These are not abstractions. Each number is a street of houses and the families inside them, ordinary people who had no say in the war's making and no armor of their own against the fire that fell out of the dark. And the men in the bombers, the men the night fighters hunted, were not monsters in the main, whatever the cause they served. They were young, most of them, and they died badly when they died, trapped in burning aircraft or drowned in the cold sea when their machines went into the channel. When John Cunningham shot down that first bomber over Sussex in the previous November, one of the German crew was thrown clear and came down in the sea and drowned there in the dark, while 2 others lived to be pulled out and made prisoner. That is the shape of it, over and over, on both sides. A burst of cannon fire in the black, a falling comet of flame, and then men in the water, or men in the wreckage, and somewhere a family that would wait for a letter that changed everything. British night fighter crews died too, and not only in combat. Night flying itself, in those years, in bad weather, with primitive instruments, taking off and landing in the dark, was a killer all its own, and good men were lost to accidents and to the sheer difficulty of the work without any enemy involved at all. So let the last word be for the people, and not for the machines, because it was always the people who mattered, and the machines were only ever tools in their hands. For Edward Bowen and the small, stubborn team in the towers at Bawdsey, who spent years shrinking a radar set until it would fit in the nose of a fighter, and who believed it could be done when many did not. For John Randall and Harry Boot in their Birmingham laboratory, whose small device would light up the radar of a whole alliance. For John Cunningham, who hated his silly nickname and knew exactly how little his eyesight and how much his team had to do with his success, and who flew on through the war and long after it as one of the finest pilots his country produced. For Jimmy Rawnsley and the other radar operators, crouched over their glowing tubes in the cold, whose quiet voices in the dark put the guns onto the target. For the women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, plotting and filtering and controlling through the long nights, whose work was the greater part of the pyramid and the smaller part of the story ever since. And for the people in the cities, the ones with no aircraft and no radar and no way to fight back, who went down into the shelters and the cellars and the underground stations and endured, night after night, the thing that all of this was built to stop. The bomber over Hampshire fell out of an empty sky in April of 1941, and its crew never understood what killed them. We can understand it now, with the whole picture spread out before us, that they could never see. It was not a wonder weapon, and not a lucky shot, and not a pilot who ate his carrots. It was a country that had learned, in one hard winter, how to see in the dark, by trusting its odd, and its patient, and its unglamorous people, to build a machine of eyes, and voices, and radio waves that no one of them could have built alone. The Germans had the science. They had the industry. They had, when they finally turned to it, a night defense as deadly as any in the world. What Britain had, in the winter it needed it most, was the back rooms and the country houses, and the room to let the outsider in, and the willingness to hand a great problem to a great many ordinary people and let them solve it together. That, and not the carrots, is how the RAF shot them down in the darkness. And the memory of the ones who built it, and the ones who flew it, and the ones who simply endured beneath it, is worth keeping alive a little longer than the men in the falling bombers ever got the chance to.